Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin daf Kaf. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island in honor of the birth of a grandson to our friend and co-learner Suri Davis. May she and her family enjoy much nachat from the new arrival as he grows LeTorah and daf, LeChuppah and LeMasim Tovim. And may his birth be the harbinger of smachot for all. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with Palti ben Layish. Okay, for whatever reason, I'm not really sure why, but the Gemara wants to put Palti ben Layish on a pedestal. And we already started with that yesterday and how Palti ben Layish, remember the story? There were two daughters of Shaul. He promised them both at different points to David, but in the end gave them both to other people. And we had a debate whether he was actually married to both of them, or at least betrothed, or whether the first betrothal really wasn't valid at all for halachic reasons, because it was a Kiddushin b'milveh, where it was a canceled loan that was the kesef Kiddushin, and that doesn't work. Or was it valid and just she died before the second one? But either which way, Michal and also Merav, but we're really focusing on Michal, ends up being married off by Shaul to somebody else while she is clearly married to David. And they end up sleeping with this sword in the bed, according to the way the Gemara tells it. And that prevents him from having relations with her every night. And he withstands the temptation night after night after night. And that puts him in a much higher category than Yosef, who is usually our prime example of someone who did not succumb to his desire with the Potiphar's wife. But that was a one-time thing. And Boaz also was a one-time thing. Ruth comes into his where he's sleeping at night, and yet he doesn't do anything. But Palti ben Layish does this night after night after night. And we're going to continue on this topic right now. Chokvosha Boaz, beginning of our daf, Anvatnutosha Palti ben Layish, which again, different interpretations, but we're going to go with the one that means that as strong as Boaz was, Palti ben Layish was even more. Kida Amran, as we explained, because he did this night after night. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my dechtiv rabot. Now we're going to have the same idea, but two different drashot coming both from Esha Chayil. It's very interesting how they take Esha Chayil, which is all about a woman, and they're basically using it to praise men, which is kind of funny. My dechtiv rabot banot asuchayil. Many women did, great things. Va'at alita kulana, but you are greater than all of them. Rabot banot asuchayil ze Yosef uBoaz. Va'at alita kulana ze Palti ben Layish. In other words, they were great, but Palti ben Layish again was even greater. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, probably bar Nachmani it should be, I think. Amar Rabbi Yonatan. My dichtiv sheker achem behevel hayofi, another section from Esha Chaya. Sheker achem, right? How do you say it? Grace is deceitful. Hevel, right? Is yofi is hevel, right? Is nothingness. Beauty is nothing. Sheker achem ze Yosef. Hevel hayofi ze Boaz. Now this doesn't usually that means it's negative. It doesn't mean it's negative. It just means it's nice to have beauty, it's nice to have grace, but that's nothing in comparison to Yirat Hashem Hititalal Ze Palti ben Layish. So we have the exact same hierarchy here. We start with Yosef, we move to Boaz, and then we have Palti ben Layish, who's greater than all. Now we're going to take that same drashav, Sheker Achem Vevelayofi, are two things that are good, but there's something even greater than that. And we're going to talk about something else. Davar acher, sheker achen ze doro shel Moshe. The generation of Moshe, and here we seem to be focusing, according to the commentaries, on how much Torah they learned. They were Torah learners. It was good. Hevel hayofi ze doro shel Yoshua, the generation of Joshua. But Yirat Hashem hititalal ze doro shel Chizkiah. Chizkiah, they really made it up there. Why Chizkiah? So some people say they were busy with war, and even though they were busy with wars, they still managed to learn Torah, and that was their greatness. Rashi says that that there's a drashav that we're going to see later on in the last chapter of Sanhedrin, that they searched the whole nation of Israel during the time of Chizkiah when there were no Amei Aretz anywhere, and that was the greatness of their generation. Okay, either which way, it's praising the generation of Chizkiah more than Moshe and Yoshua. Now we have a second drasha, Sheker Achen Ze Doro Shel Moshe v'Yoshua. Hevel hayofi ze doro shel Chizkiah. We're putting Chizkiah in the second category, and now we're going to have a third category, which is even greater. Yirat Hashem hititalal ze doro shel Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Eli. This is the Rabbi Yehuda we see in the Mishnah all the time, and he actually appears a lot in our chapter. Keeps arguing with the rabbis about certain things. The rabbis say, no, it can't be done. He says, well, you could do Yibam if you're the king, and we're going to see a few other things he thinks you could do. Well, Amru alav Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eli. Why was it so great in his time? There was such poverty. Okay, so in Chizkiah was time of war, and yet people learned Torah. He says there was such poverty in the time of Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eli, and yet they still learned Torah. Right? What was the greatness of their poverty? How can you see how great? Because they would say that 6 students would cover themselves with one talit. Okay, there it means they didn't have clothing or they didn't have blankets or right, whatever it was. It's pretty bad situation, pretty bleak situation, and yet they were able to make time for learning Torah. So there we have it, that these are different. Okay, we kind of segued away from Palti ben Layish, but we started with saying how great is Palti ben Layish. We then took the structure of this Sheker Achem v'Hevel Yofi Isha Yirat Hashem Hititalal to say that there's people who were good and then there were people who were great, or there were generations that were good and then there were generations that were great. So we moved off of Palti ben Layish because we just had the exact same structure, but talking about something entirely different. And we really got, in the end, to learning Torah. Okay, back to our Mishnah. We're now getting to the second Mishnah of our chapter. And if you remember, the first Mishnah, or at least I think in the book of Mishnah, wasn't known the first, but the first one quoted by us was a long Mishnah, started with the Kohen Gadol. And all the things about a Kohen Gadol, we started with the Kohen Gadol about being a judge and witnesses and all that. Then we moved to the burial practice. We did chalitza and yibum and all that. Then we did the burial practices. And then we did the same thing with the king, except we didn't get to the burial practices yet. We did the king in terms of can he be judged and all that. Then we moved on. If you haven't yet listened to Daf Michal, it went up already yesterday, so you can listen. Then we moved on to the chalitza and yibum. And now we're moving on to what happens when a relative dies. Mate lo mate. This sounds very similar. The king shouldn't leave, the Kohen Gadol should not leave the temple. He should not leave his palace. And this is because we don't want to see a king crying in a weak position. It's very important. We already learned that his fear should be upon the people. You don't want to see him in a place of weakness. So he doesn't go out, cries in his house, in his room with, all alone. Right? It's a crazy thing to think that the king wouldn't go out to bury their dead. Rabbi Yehuda, in his classic fashion, as we keep seeing him, says, if he wants to, he can go. And what's our proof? We're going to keep bringing proofs from David HaMelech. David goes after the bier of Avner. Let's talk about Avner for a quick minute. Avner was the Sar Tzavai, he was the head of the army under Shaul. Okay, so which ends up kind of making him an arch enemy of David. Then he kills the brother of Yoav, who is the Sar Tzava of David. Then when Shaul dies, he, instead of saying, we're going to coronate David as king, he sides with Ishbosheth, and David becomes king in Hebron, if I'm not mistaken. And thank you. And thank you for saying I was right. He's Melech in Hebron, and Avner makes Ishbosheth, the son of Shaul, into the king over the rest of the nation. And that goes on for about 2 years, and there's like half a year till they end up going all with David, and David becomes king over all of Israel. Yoav basically ends up, you're saying 7 years, but we're going to see 2.5 years that Ishbosheth was king before, okay, and then another half year till actually they make David the king. So now Yoav goes and kills Avner out of revenge for his brother. And the concern is people think that David was part of it. And David wasn't part of it, because then in the end, Avner goes with David, and then they think maybe David was stabbing him in the back. Okay? And David wasn't. David had nothing to do with it. And what the Mishnah says right now, the Chachamim say in the Mishnah, is the fact that David went after the bed of Avner doesn't show anything. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, look, David went after the bed of Avner. So you see, here we have a king who went out to mourn the bier. Thank you. So I was translating literally the mita, but yes, a bier. So now Amelech David olech achar mita. Amrulo, Rabbi said to him, that's not a proof for your position. David was just trying to tell the people, I'm with you. I'm mournful for Avner. I had nothing to do with this. And he was just trying to exonerate himself. So the people wouldn't rebel against him. Anyone who was on Avner's side was going to say, I can't believe you killed Avner. Like what happened? Avner went and sided with David, and his people went, and then he kills Avner. So, ukisha mavlinoto. Okay, so that's that section. So we're going to get back to that in the Gemara. Last part of the Mishnah. Kisha mavlinoto, when we have this seudat havra'a, which is the meal after they get back from the cemetery, which, okay, the king never went to the cemetery, but he still has the seudat havra'a. Now, usually the Avelim would sit on the floor, but we saw with the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol wouldn't sit on the floor. The people would sit on the floor out of respect for the Kohen Gadol. He would sit on a safsal, which was lower. The king is going to sit on a dargash, which is presumably higher. We don't yet know what it is. We're going to have a whole discussion in the Gemara. We're going to learn about beds in the time of the Talmud, or the time of the Mishnah, or in the time of the Talmud, what they thought was in the time of the Mishnah, because they don't really know. And we'll get into beds and ropes that tied the beds into their place and all sorts of things like that. Tanu Rabbanit. So the Gemara starts off with a brayta. Makom shenagu nashim latzeit achar mita yotzot. Lifnei mita yotzot. Now we segue off of this for a minute, and you'll see in a minute why we're going to get to this. What do women do at a funeral? So first of all, if your Hebrew's good, we have a new section on the Hebrew side of content on the daf. Sometimes we have both languages. Some people are better in one language. So as I would say, for Alana Stein-Haynes Din Daf, we have a comparable of Mirav Tubal Kahana in Hebrew. And she talked this week about women going to funerals. And there's this whole custom that women don't go to funerals in certain places. And it's based on the Zohar. And it's actually an interesting shiur because she talks about how does the Zohar influence halacha. That's a common thing that often things in the Shulchan Aruch actually come from the Zohar, which is very interesting. And she talks about the whole topic of women going to funerals. Now, obviously from the Gemara, women were going to funerals because they're talking about women going out before the bed or after, before the beer or after the beer. So there's this whole question now. Do the women go in front or in back? Now, you would think for tzniut purposes, right? You don't want the women in the front, then the men see the women. But according to the Tanakhama here, makom shnagu nashim latzeit achar mita yotzot lifnei mita yotzot. It's all dependent on the custom in the place, whether they go in front or whether they go behind the beer. And the assumption is wherever the women are, the men are on the other place. Okay, if the women are in the front, the men are in the back. If the women are in the back, the men are in the front. Rabbi Yehuda omer lo olam nashim lifnei mita yotzot. And what's his proof? Shekain, now you see why they brought this up here. Shekain matzinu b'David she'atza achar mitato shel Avner. Now it said, Shneimar b'David hamelech David holech achar hamita. He went after the beer. That means he was obviously with the men. He wasn't in the middle of the women. So it must be the men go behind and the women go in front. Amrulo, again, we have this conversation. The rabbi said, what are you talking about? Lo haya davar ela lefayes et ha'am. Now here we have a different thing that proves about the different ramification of that David was just trying to appease the people, that he hadn't done anything wrong. Now in the Mishnah, we used it to say that's why David was there in the first place. Now we're going to explain, that explains why David was behind the beer, but yet it doesn't necessarily indicate that the women were in front. Why? Well, number one, lo haya davar lefayes ta'am, right? That was why he did it. Vinit paisu, and it was successful. How do we know it was successful? Well, what did he do to make sure it was successful and that everyone was convinced? Well, he had to be seen by everybody. How can he be seen by everyone if he's only with the men? Therefore, according to the rabbis here, he would go by where the men were, and then he would go where the women were, and then he would go back to the men. He was walking back and forth, and that's why it says he was lachar mita. And it could still be that he was with the women. It doesn't mean that he was only with the men. How do we know that he must have walked back and forth between the men and the women? Notice how they say it. The whole nation and all of Israel. First of all, it's a little redundant. It's a way of saying everybody, including the women. That the king wasn't part of the plot to kill Avner. And that's in the end of that section. And that proves, according to the rabbis, that you can't learn from David where the men were because he obviously went in between the men and the women. Okay, so we have another machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis relating again to the same story, but a totally different ramification of whether or how you understand that story and how that affects what you understand about where people were. Right. The original machloket in the Mishnah was, does the king even go out to bury the dead? And the second was, can we see where the men were based on David? And the answer in both, according to the rabbis, is no, even though Rabbi Yehuda thinks yes. Jarash Rava, another thing having to do with this story and proving the same idea that David had to prove himself, even though it was pretty clear from the text already. But Darash Rava, my dichtiv vayavo kol ha'am lahavrot et David. It says the whole nation came lahavrot et David. That means to eat the seudat havra'a with him, right? To be be mourning with him. Ktiv lehachrot ukrinan lehavrot. It says it's the classic kriyuktiv, though it's not classic. I'll tell you in a minute why. But kriyuktiv is where it's written in one way and it's pronounced in a different way. Okay, so we saw this before with yesh em lemekra, yesh em lemasoret. It's a little bit different, but somewhat similar, where the text says a certain letter. Now you could see kaf and bet often switch because they're very similar to each other. Well, it's written as lahachrot, but it's read as lahavrot. B'tchila lahachroto. In the beginning, they came to destroy him, to cut him off. Right? They were upset with him. Ulevaself lahavroto. But in the end, they came lahavrot, which is to eat with him this meal. What's interesting about this? Well, if you look in the text of the Chumash, if you haven't had a chance to open it yet, because that's the first thing I always think when you see these, let's see, is it really written inside that way? And in fact, it's not written that way in our Torah. In our Chumashim, it's written as lahavrot, without the kaf. Okay, it doesn't appear at all, not in a kriyuktiv or anything. So this is another example. We had this before with the Aim Lamikra, Aim Lamasoret Sugya, where the texts that were in front of them aren't necessarily matching the text that we have. And traditions, they have, over time, sometimes, those things were different. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Mipnei ma ne'enash Avner. Now we assume that if Yoav killed him, it wasn't just that Yoav was exacting revenge, but God must have had something to do with it. There must have been some sort of reason why Avner was deserving of an early death. So what did he do wrong? And we're going to have another machloket here. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Mipnei ma ne'enash Avner mipnei shayta lo limchot b'Shaul v'lo Michal. He should have protested Shaul's actions. Shaul's actions where? Well, there's a debate among the commentaries. Some say when he killed the city of Nov, if you remember, the city of Nov helped protect David, and then Shaul sent them to kill wasn't necessarily him who sent, whatever, this whole story, but really it was from the tzivoy of Shaul to kill the people in the city, and he should have protested that. He was in a position, this is a good example, right, of leadership. When you're in a position of power and you see someone abusing the power, you should say something about it. And he was punished because he didn't say anything about it. Some people think it's just the fact that that Shaul was chasing David all the time to kill him, and he should have stopped him, right? There was this constant chasing and trying to kill David all those years, and again, he could have stopped it. So there's a debate exactly what he should have protested. It could be all of that he should have protested, and he didn't. That's the first interpretation. Rabbi Yitzchak disagrees with this interpretation, and only at the end of this discussion are we going to get to, so what did he think Avner did wrong? But he said, Michal v'lo na'ana. Who says he didn't protest? He protested. It just didn't work. Shaul was very set in his ways and didn't want to listen to his advisor, right? We know that happens also. We have leaders who make mistakes or do things that are not right, and people tell them, don't do this, but they do what they want anyway. So, Michal v'lo na'ana, u'shnei mikra chad darshu. Now, they both learned it from the same pasuk, and here's a great example of it really depends on your tone, whether you ask it as a question or say something right. As we all know, because we're learning a book that has no punctuation, and it's all about how you punctuate can make all the difference. So they both learn it from this pasuk. Okay, when David was saying a kina for Avner, when Avner died, Vayomar. Hakimot naval yamud Avner, will Avner die like a bad person? Yadecha lo asurot, your hands were not tied. Raglecha lo nechushtaim hugashu, your legs were not tied up in chains. Manda, okay, and the rest, I just want to read the next little section of that pasuk. Kinfo lifnei b'nei avlana falsa, and you fell before sinners, okay, people who did bad things. Manda amar lo micha, so the one who says he didn't protest and he was wrong understands this pasuk as a negative thing. Hachi kamar, yadecha lo asurot, v'raglecha lo nechushtaim ugashu, your hands weren't tied, your legs weren't tied, you had what to do and you didn't do it. And therefore, my time alo machita, why didn't you protest? And that's why you fell in front of the with bad people. And those who say he protested but wasn't answered, it's a question. Are you going to die like a bad person? What did you do wrong? Your hands weren't tied. And because you protested, and your hands weren't tied, you were free to do what you did, and you did it. And therefore, my time, what's the reason? Why did you fall before sinful, like a sinner? I don't understand. And then that's a totally different way of saying that statement. So there we have the two different opinions. Did he protest? Did he not protest? And both based on the same pasuk. And now we have to go back and say, okay, so why was Avner punished? We understand according to the first interpretation, because he didn't protest. If you say he protested, we still have to explain why he was punished. So what's the reason? Laman Damar Michal, which is Rabbi Yitzchak, who says Michal, he did protest. My time he anish. Why was he punished? Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak sheshiha malchut Beit David shtei shanim v'mechzi. Here we get to the 2.5 years. He pushed off by coronating Ishbosheth 2.5 years before David was appointed king over all of Israel. That pushed off David becoming king over all of Israel for 2.5 years, and that was the problem. Now we're going to get to this dargash sugya, which is a bit of a strange sugya. You have to wonder, why are they spending a long time talking about the details of the beds and what they were like and all that? But, this is another thing they do, is to try to understand things in the Mishnah. And again, we've talked about this many times. It's very clear here that the Amoraim, who were living in Babylonia and a few generations later, didn't understand the words that were used by the Mishnah sometimes. They didn't understand what their life was like, what a dargash was. Okay, they didn't have dargashim, so they had to figure out, what is this term dargash? And you'll see what they use to kind of help them figure out. We're going to have two explanations. The way it's going to work is like this. We're going to have 3 difficulties raised against the first explanation. Each time we raise a difficulty, someone's going to say, oh, that's not really a difficulty, and reject it, but bring a different difficulty. And then in the end, though, the third difficulty is going to remain, and therefore we're going to offer a different solution. And we'll have 2 answers, but the first one's really rejected. My dargash, Amar Ula Arsa Degada. It's a bed of fortune, like a mazal bed. We don't know exactly what that is, okay? But apparently they had beds that were like, this is something probably the Amoraim had, and they said, oh, that must be what the dargash is. It was a bed that people didn't sleep on. They used it for a bed of fortune, and they really didn't use it. It was like something decorative in the house. You have to think, they didn't have such big houses. Why were they putting things that were unnecessary? But, people had all sorts of beliefs and things, and I guess they thought it was going to bring them good fortune. So they had this kind of bed. And that's what the dargash is, and that's what the king sits on. So now, Amrle Rabbanan Le'ula, the rabbi said to Ula, Mi'ika midi, Ada Ida lo utvine, Vahashtam utvine le. Seems very strange that you should have this bed that no one ever sits on, and then when the king becomes an avel, then, he's a mourner, then he uses it all of a sudden. That's a little strange. To which Matkivla Rava says, that's not a question. My kushia, why is that a question? Dilma midi dehavi achila v'shtiya. In general, the seudat havra'a, we do things very differently. Just like the way we eat and drink is different than we eat and drink any other time of the year. Dada idna lo uchil nevelo ashkine. Until then, people don't feed you and give you drinks. Right? The whole thing of a seudat havra'a is people are supposed to serve you. The avelim are not supposed to serve themselves. Now, unless you have servants all around the clock, most people serve themselves food. And even if they don't, even if other people serve them, it's not that other people have to serve them. If they want to take their own thing, they can. But the seudat havra'a, you're supposed to actually serve them, and people are not supposed to serve themselves. So here we do something totally different than we do every other day of the year. So why won't we say in that same way, the king will sit on the dargash that one time? So that's really not a question. But if you want a difficulty with that explanation, I have a different reason to raise a difficulty. Dargash einot tzarich lichvoto, ela zokfo. Source says that when it comes to the dargash, now there was a custom, we learned about it in Moed Katan, custom of mourners to flip the beds over. That's what they would do. Okay, so imagine a bed, you have 4 poles and a base, and you flip it over, and then it's much lower down, and they would do things on that lower bed. The way we sit on lower chairs, kind of similar, but it's a little different because they actually turn over all the beds in the house. And they say, but when you're turning over all the beds in the house, don't turn over the dargash. You just turn it on it. You put it on its side. You don't turn it over completely. You put it on its side. So now, if you say it's a bed of fortune like all the other beds, it's just one that was there for mazal. Why shouldn't you turn it upside down? It says in a braita, it's not just that you turn over your own bed. They would turn over every single bed in the house. So if this is a bed of fortune, what's the difference if it's a bed of fortune or not a bed of fortune? It should be turned over like all the others. And why are you putting it on its side and not upside down? To which the Gemara says, that's not a good question. Umay kushya, why is that a question? The There's something that was called a bed that they would use, right? Apparently bed didn't mean exactly what beds mean in our day, or it was, but just they would use for other things. Maybe they didn't have other kinds of storage areas. They would put vessels on it sometimes. So if they had a bed that was just for putting utensils on, dekatane, it says in a bright day, you don't have to turn it upside down. If it was meant for kelim, in that same note, you could say the bed of fortune, this mazal bed, you don't have to turn over because it was a bed of fortune. It wasn't a regular bed. So this obviously doesn't mean anything. I like your comment, Gita, about a bed used for storage like any teenager, right? I've got some of those who aren't even teenagers whose beds look that way, without mentioning names. So now, el ikasha hakasha, but if you want a difficulty, here's a difficulty. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omel, dargash, and here we're really going to have a difficulty with this interpretation. Dargash matir karbitin v'hu nofel me'elav. Okay, this is we're going to have to try to figure out and understand what this is. But you untie the ropes that are attaching it. Okay, now again, imagine a bed. You have a base, and then instead of putting boards across and a mattress on top like we usually do, then or springs or whatever it might be. But if you have a wooden bed, what they would do is they would attach. Okay, soon we're going to talk about perhaps it was a piece of leather. They would attach it with rope to the sides, to the bed, to the boards on the sides. So what do you do for a dargash? You just let the ropes loose, and that middle part where people would sit on would fall, and that would be your turning over the bed. Instead of turning over the bed, you would just let loose the ropes on the sides, and everything would fall. Okay, or the loops, you could call them the karbitim. Now, isakadatak artsa degada, karbitimi, if you're going to say it's a bed of fortune, beds didn't have those loops on them. There was no such thing. So it can't be. Okay, again, this is hard for us to understand because we don't even know what the beds were. We don't know what the dargash was, but they basically say this can't be then. There are no karbiti. Okay, so now Elakiata Ravin Amar. Now here we have the person from Israel, Ravin, who's bringing the Torah from Israel, which helps a little better for the Babylonians who didn't necessarily know what this was. Says Amar liyahume Rabbana v'Ravtachli Pashmei Tavshchiach b'Shuka Digildai. Okay, I was told by it's from Tachlifa. He was in the tanner's shuk, so he knew all the stuff about leather and things they made with leather, and he explained to me, V'amarle, my dargash arsa ditzala. It's a bed made with leather. Okay, and this is why I mentioned leather before, and that's going to explain the karbitin. Okay, and Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Here we're going to go into more detail and explain. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, also Amoraim from Israel. Dargash, turning out Amabet, Serugo mitocho, mita seruga me'al gaba. If you have the Quran, they have great pictures, but I think I can explain it pretty well. You have these beams going around the bed, right? The 4 beams. Now, what they would do is they would make holes in the leather, put a rope through it, tie it to the bed boards around, and that would basically hold it in place. It's like we have a spring bed. It's very similar, right? The springs are attached to the base, and then they're attached to the bottom, right? To the base there. Now, there's the dargash. It would be the serug, which means how they would weave in the rope would be into the bedboard, meaning they would make a hole in the bedboard and string it through, okay, or rope it through. A mita serugame al gaba. With the bed, they would wrap the rope around the beam. They wouldn't make a hole in the beam and thread it through. They would tie it around and then tie knots, okay? And that was the difference between the dargash and the bed. But this is going to be rejected, okay? In other words, everyone's in agreement now that we're not accepting, it wasn't a bed of fortune. It was a unique kind of bed that was done with leather. How is it different from a regular bed that might have been done with leather? Well, the way the ropes connected it to the bed. Did it go through the beams or over the beams? That's the first explanation. But now we're going to reject this because of this Mishnah. Meitive. This is a Mishnah in Kelim. Kelim is all about impurity of vessels. Impurity of vessels, a vessel becomes susceptible to impurity when it's finished. So always they discuss what's the final stage of this item, and we're going to talk about a bed. And then we're going to say that clearly doesn't make sense if the bed had the ropes wrapped around the beams, because if you have vessels made of wood, from when are they susceptible to impurity? When are they finished? Hamita v'ha'arisa mishiyashufein ba'or hadag. Okay, so the bed and the right now he says another type of bed really. If you would when you would sand down with using, they would use the skin of the fish when they would sand it down. Now, if you say the bed has the ropes wrapped around the wood, then there's no need to sand it down because no one ever comes in contact with the wood. You sand things down because you're going to touch it. But if there's ropes wrapped around it and not in the right through threaded through a hole or roped through a hole, then right, you don't need that. It's ready even before that because no one's going to touch the wood anyway. Therefore, Ella Hava Hamitocha. We're going to say both the bed and the dargash must be through the beam and not around the beam. And if it's through the beam, then you understand why it needs to be sanded. And that resolves that source. So you understand they're basically keep bringing in sources that mention dargash to figure out if our definition is right. That's the only way they could really figure it out because they don't have a picture, for example, of a dargash, which would have helped or something like that. But what's the difference? Mita yule ba'afuke bebizione, dargash yule ba'afuke ba'avkata. Okay, what does this mean? Well, they would, again, how would they rope it through? They would rope through in the regular bed, like we explained. What we thought was the dargash before, now we say is the regular bed. A dargash is where there would be a loop around the bedboard, and then we would loop another rope into that loop. And that explains the original source we saw. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said that matir karbitav, you let go of the loops. That's why you would do it with the dargash and not with the bed. With the bed, you can't undo it in that way. That's why you have to flip it over. Because if you start, you're going to have to cut the rope because it's tied in a very strong knot there. In the dargash, there's a loop around the bed base, and then there's another loop that you loop into there. That's very easy to just untie that rope and let the whole bed fall apart. But you can only do that in a dargash, and that's what we're going to see right now. I'm Rabbi Yaakov, I'm Rabbi Yosef ben Levi, halachat Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that when you do kfiyat mitah for the dargash, that's all you do. You just let go of these loops, and with that, it's done. And I'm Rabbi Yaakov bar Ami mitasha naklitea yotzin so kva. Another thing, Rabbi Yaakov bar Ami says, with this, we're going to finish our discussion about beds. If you had a canopy bed, right, what's canopy bed? I actually used to have one when I was a little kid. It's got these big beams on the top, and then you would throw something over it. And canopy bed, we never threw anything over it. I don't know why, but it was a canopy bed, and because the holes are so high, right? When you have a low bed, it's very easy to turn upside down, but you can't turn a bed upside down. It'll fall, right? It's imbalanced at that point. So what do? You just put it on its side, like we saw before. There was the bed, you put it on its side, and that's all you need to do. Okay. With this, we're finished with our sugya of what is a dargash and trying to figure that out. Okay, new Mishnah. So now we have a king. We're back to the king. Other things about a king. So if the king wants to go out to war, this is classic, right? The president of the United States can't decide we're going out to war by himself, right? Neither can the prime minister of Israel or the prime minister in England or wherever you might be, right? It's not up to one person alone. In Jewish courts, what do you have to do? You need the Sanhedrin of 71. Now, we already know this because we saw it in the first Mishnah, the first chapter we're going to go back to, and the Gemara is going to ask that because we already learned. It's one of the things the Sanhedrin of 71 does. If the king wants to decide to walk through your field or your house and say, this is how I'm getting to where I want to get to, they're allowed to do that and no one can stop them. And how wide a path they want to make to get through, there's no minimum. King can do whatever he wants. When they go out to war and the people bring back booty from the war, they have to give to the king first. Okay, he can take the booty and he gets to take it first. So now the Gemara is going to start with each of those things. It's going to start with the first one. We already learned that. If you want to go out to war, right, an optional war, you need the Sanhedrin. So why are you telling us again? So the obvious reason is since they're talking about what things the king can do, so they mention it also because the king can't go alone to Mechemet Rishut and decide on his own. He needs to get the Sanhedrin on board. So each one is mentioned in its place. And this is a good time to really go back to what we said in the introduction to the Masechet always find introductions are a little empty before you've actually seen it, but now you can really see the structure of our Masechet so far. We talked about how there's the judicial, there's the legislative, right? And here we're getting the first thing we dealt with was the court system, the judicial system. And now we're getting to the executive branch of the king and the Kohen Gadol of being the religious or temple-based leader, right? And we're basically dealing with the different types of leadership that there is in the community and tackling each one as its own topic, right? We got to deal with this one, we got to deal with that one. What are the rules? What are the limitations? Or maybe there aren't so many limitations, which we're going to see with the king. So that's the first thing. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Kol ha'amor b'parashat melech mutar bo. This is a fascinating topic. We're going to have a machloket Shmuel and Rav about this. Now, there's a debate what the Parshat Melech is. Some people think it's talking about the psukim in Sefer Dvarim when it talks about the king. And we're going to get to those psukim very soon. Not today, but we'll get to those psukim that talk about all the rules for the king. But most people think that this is talking about in Sefer Shmuel. Now, what happens in Sefer Shmuel after the terrible book of Shoftim and everything's, disorderly, that people say, enough, we don't want Shoftim, we want a king for the whole nation. We don't want local judges, and we don't want this terrible vicious cycle we've been in. We don't want Isha Yashar Be'enav Yaseh, everyone does what they want. We want one king, and they say we want it like the Goyim. We want it like the people that are living around us. We see it's a good model. We want to do that. Shmuel seems pretty upset by this. He says it's not the way it's supposed to be. And he starts with a whole long diatribe. And he says, the king is going to do this. And he's going to take your children and make them into slaves. And he's going to take your animals. And he's going to seize whatever he wants, which is what we saw in the Mishnah. The king has the right to do that. So the question is, all these things that Shmuel said, are they true? Can the king really do this? Was Shmuel giving like a halachic list of the king has the rights to do this? Or did he maybe have a different agenda? And we're going to talk about some possible other agendas he had by saying that, and he didn't really mean that the king is allowed to do this. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol Amor b'Parshat Melech. I'm going back to what I read now and explaining it. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, everything it says there, Melech mutar bo. This is what the king can do. Okay, the king is allowed. Shmuel was giving a list, a grocery list of what all the things the king could do. Rav Amar, Lo ne'emra parsha zo ela la'ayem alehem. Okay, now I specifically didn't define what the option B is because option B could be either B or C. And now we're going to define what these are. So according to Rav, this was to threaten them. Now, not for what you might have thought, okay, because I think the obvious, at least when I read the Tanakh, when I learned Sefer Shmuel, what I thought is that he was trying to scare them into not wanting to have a king, into changing their minds. But that's not what Rav says. Rav says it's to threaten them. Shene'amar som tasim alecha melech. And now he quotes the psukim in the Torah. Place upon you a king. And the drashan, that pasuk is shetehei mato alecha. That you should fear the king. So he's telling them, this is what a king's going to do. And you're going to fear that king. Because the king can do any of these things if the king wants. And therefore, you should be fearful of the king. So scare them into fearing the king. Not scaring them into changing their mind and saying, we don't want a king. Just to understanding what a king means. That you have to fear the king. But not that the king is really allowed to do all those things. And now we point out, before we get to the third opinion, this machloka between Rav and Shmuel, where there's only two opinions right now, is a machloka Tanaim Kitanai. Rabbi Yossi Omer, we're going to now see that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda fall into those same two opinions, and really Rav and Shmuel fall in line with Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, who preceded them. Kol Amor b'Parshat Melech mutar bo. That's Shmuel. The king can do all those things. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo ne'emar parsha zo ela kadei la'ayem alehem. It was just to threaten them. Shene'emar som tasim alecha melech shetehei mato alecha. You understand? You should fear the king. V'chein haya Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now Rabbi Yehuda goes off on something else, but connected. Shalosh mitzvot nitzdavu Yisrael b'knisatan la'aretz is very famous, and it appears in the very beginning of Sefer Melachim of the Rambam, of Hilchot Melachim of the Rambam. There were three mitzvot that the Jews were commanded when they got into the land, and we're going to see later that it's in this order. Rabbi Yossi is going to quote the same thing and then say, I'm not sure what the order is, but then darshans that it's exactly in this order. Number one, lami melech, put a king. Number two, lachrit zaro shel Amalek, destroy Amalek. Number three, livnot lan beit habechira, and then build the temple. That was an aside. We'll come back to that soon. Rabbi Nehorai Omer. Now we get to a third opinion. Lo ne'emra parsha zo ela keneged tarom tan. The Jews started complaining, we need a king. And Shmuel said this all just against him. This is what the simple reading of it is. Shneimar, v'amarta asim alai melech, v'chulei. Right? And he says to them, you know what? You said you want a king? Yeah, you don't want a king. A king is bad. The king's going to do all these terrible things. And he really wanted them to renege. So Tanya, now we have another Braita, which talks about, was it good that they asked for a king? Was it not good? Well, this position is, it's somewhat in between. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Zkenim Shabadur Kohogan Shalu, Shene'emal, Tna Lanu Melech L'Shoftenu. So this kenim in that generation, the elders, they had for the right reasons. They wanted a king. They said, we want a king to rule us. Aval Amei Haaretz Shebahem Kilkalu, but the Amei Haaretz, they had the wrong idea. They said, Shene'emar, V'hayinu gam kechol goyim u'shafatnu malkeinu v'yatza lefanenu. They said we want it like all the other nations. That was the wrong reason. In other words, we had a split in the people. Some people wanted it for the right reasons. Some people wanted it for the wrong reasons. Tanya, now we're going to have another Braita, which goes back to what Rabbi Yehuda was talking about, and it's now in the name of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Shalosh mitzvot mitzvah Yisrael b'knisatan la'aretz. There were 3 mitzvot they were commanded to do. La'amid la'im melech, to place a king. La'achritza, right, you get this. If you think it's a mitzvah, la'amid melech, then obviously it wasn't bad that they were asking for a king, right? If you say that it wasn't a mitzvah, then, right, they were asking for a king, and that wasn't right. So Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda were both of the opinion it was right. They just had a different idea about what Shmuel was telling them about this long list. Was it really true, or was they just trying to get them to fear the king? But they both agree that it's a mitzvah to put a king. And to destroy Amalek, and to build the temple. But I'm not sure which goes first. But then he's looked in the psukim, when it says ki yad al kes yam milchama Hashem b'Amalek midor dor. Okay, that's right. The hand is on the chair of God. Havei omer la'amid la melech tchila. How do we get from there to have a melech first? Because in the beginning of the pasuk it talks about the kes yad, the chair of God. Ein kisei el melech. That means the chair of the king. How do we know this? Shenemar vayeshev Shlomo al kisei Hashem lemelech. He sat on the chair of God, on the throne of God, as king. So here you see the beginning of the episode talks about king, and then it talks about Amalek. But we still don't know which one comes first, to build the temple or to destroy Amalek. Okay, it says, this is in the Torah in Dvarim, it says, and when God, and it's calm from your enemies, God will help you, right? Then it says, right? Then you should bring your korbanot there to the place where I choose. So that sounds like first deal with your enemies, then you'll build the temple. And furthermore, right? So therefore, and by David it says that. Remember, David wants to build the temple. In the end, Shlomo does it. But right? All of a sudden, all the wars were over. And then it says, right? He says to Natan Navi, I'm sitting in this beautiful palace, right? What about God? We need to build a temple for God. So also, both in the Torah and in with David, it says it in that order. Okay, now we're going to finish with this thing about Shlomo. Because we said Shlomo was sitting on the kisei of Hashem, what does that mean? Well, we're going to learn from here. Amarish Lakish b'tchila malach Shlomo ala el Yomin. He was even king of the up above. He was king of the whole world, according to the Gemara here, and the world above. How do we know this? Shenemar vayeshev Shlomo kisei Hashem. He sat on the throne of God. What does that mean? If not, he ruled over the world above as well. Ulevasov, but what happened? Shlomo married all these wives, and we're going to get to that tomorrow in the Mishnah of the king can't marry a lot of wives, and he married non-Jewish wives, and that pulled him away from God. And then Levasov malach ala tachtonim. Then he was only down below. Then it says he was a ruler from Tifsach to Aza, meaning only in this world. Now, what is Tifsach and Aza? Machloket Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel Chadam are Tifsach b'sof ha'olam va'aza b'sof ha'olam. They're each on opposite sides of the world. Okay, we don't have such a thing. The world is round, but that's the way they understood it. B'chadam are Tifsach va'aza b'hadei adadi avuyatbe. They were next to each other. Kshem shemalach al Tifsach va'aza kach malach al kol ha'olam kulo. Either way, they think it's the whole world, but were they next to each other? And it just means, right, just like he ruled in these two places, he ruled everywhere, or were they far from each other, and it means he ruled from there to there. But clearly not in the world above. Ulevasov, and then as time went on, his rule got smaller and smaller and smaller. Levasov lo malach el Yisrael. Then it was only on the Jews. On Israel. Shneimar ani kohelet hayiti melech al Yisrael. right? That's in Kohelet, which is written by Shlomo or attributed to Shlomo. He says, I was Kohelet, the king on Israel. Ulevasov lo malach el al Yerushalayim. Then only it was in Jerusalem. Shenemar devrei Kohelet ben David melech b'Yerushalayim. He was king in Jerusalem. Sounds like only in Jerusalem. Ulevasov lo malach el al mitato. Then he was only king over his bed, because there's that pasuk about the bed. He named it Tato Shlomo, and there's the 60, giborim around the bed. That was where he ruled. Ulevasov lo malach ela al maklo. And in the end, he was only ruler on his staff. How did we get to his staff? Well, Shenemar zeh chalki mikol amali. Right? Remember, Kohelet's all about, right? This is all I have from all my work. Like, I have nothing left. What is nothing? Well, Rav and Shmuel, Chadamar maklo, Chadamar gudo. One said it was his staff. One said it was his cloak. And that was all he was left with in the end, ruling over. Now, the big question is, okay, this basically shows Shlomo was brought to his downfall. You might remember that crazy story with Ashmedai and Shlomo, and he poses as Shlomo, and he basically ruined Shlomo's malchut. Also that story. But basically, they're saying, according to this scheme, you could see that there were times in Shlomo's life where all he was like a nobody. And that was later, right? Not before he became king. So the last question I'm going to leave you with is Hadar o lo Hadar. Did he ever go back, though? That he became ruler over nothing, but did he go back to greatness at some point? Well, machloket Rav and Shmuel. Chadamar Hadar, Chadamar lo Hadar. We saw a lot of machloket Rav and Shmuel today. One said he went back to greatness. One said he didn't. Mandamar lo Hadar, Melech v'Hedyot. The one who said he didn't go back said he was first king, then he just became a regular person. Manda Amar Hadar, the one who said he did go back, says Melech v'Hedyot v'Melech. He was king, then he was a regular person, then he eventually came back to being a king. With that, we finished for today. And I think this is here, besides that we got there because of the Kisei Hashem, but to show the fragility of leadership and, what could lead people to stray and ruin their leadership, and kind of ruin their stronghold that they think they're so powerful, and then they end up bringing about their downfall. So we started with Palti ben Layish and how great he was. We moved to some other drashot connected. We went to the king and the minagei avelut. We got to what is a dargash. We talked about women. Where were they in the funeral processions? We talked about was Avner. We got into the whole story of David and Avner, and what did Avner do wrong? Did he protest against Shaul? Did he not? And if not, then if he did, then what did he do wrong and why was he killed? Then we moved to the Mechemet Reshut, Shivim Becha. We said we had to mention that a second time. Then we talked about the king can do whatever he wants. The question is, can he really do whatever he wants? All those things listening to Shmuel, is that true? Is it not true? Were there ulterior motives that Shmuel had for saying that, and it really wasn't that the king can actually do all those things? And then we'll get back to the Shalal. We'll start with that tomorrow. And we finish with Shlomo HaMelech and how he ruined his stronghold that he had even on the Elyonim, and it ended up being on nothing. With that, we finish for today. Nice thoughts. Let's hope that our manhigim make the right decisions and pave a good path and try to fix the complicated situation that we're in right now. Bring back the hostages quickly.